We're now moving on to facial trauma, and delighted to introduce the internationally renowned facial trauma surgeon, Simon Holmes. And I think he has two patients with you, and they are George Bowden, who's an avid amateur cyclist like me, but who unfortunately, unlike me, lost his lower jaw, his lip and chin in an accident in which he crashed into a solid object at speed. And then Tom Hosking, who lost his nose.
Hi, I'm George Bowden. I guess I probably called myself a trauma patient until 2 minutes ago. Now I'm a trauma human being, apparently, according to Prof. Hutchison. Good Friday, 22nd April 2011, was a beautiful sunny day. I decided to go out for a speedy trading ride on my brand new time trial bike. But after an hour or so, rather stupidly, I managed to crash my face and other bits of my body into a forward-facing iron pole, part of a parked road-laying machine. Needless to say, as Arsene Wenger of Arsenal would say, I did not see it. The impact, taken primarily by my mandible, occurred at 25 miles an hour. I've got a very clever bike. The download said 25 miles an hour. Not a good idea. Good for my bike race training program, but not so great for me. I don't remember the moment of impact, but I do remember shortly after being on the road in some pain and believing I had the usual cyclist collection of broken ribs, sternum, collarbone, most of which I've done before. What I didn't understand was why I couldn't produce any form of intelligible speech to the group of kindly folks who were huddled around me. Little did I know that I had a hole in my face the size of a man's fist. The missing bits were to be found, being collected up in a plastic bag by the local retained fireman. I crashed outside the local retained fire station, thank goodness. The bag contained the majority of my avulsed mandible, a medical term there which I've learned. Avulsed means throwing it away. A load of teeth, a lot of skin, and pretty importantly, the majority of my lower lip. Time passed, a helicopter ride to an Essex maxillofacial unit, which turned out to be shut over a bank holiday. Brilliant. I was then taken by road to the Royal London Hospital, and an emergency operation took place, which put the parts back in. A few days later, I met Simon Holmes for the first time, and Simon looked at me. He said, "George, I don't think the operation has been a success. The skin, the transplant is either dead or dying." But he then said, "We've seen worse traumas than this, and there are plenty of options we have to get you better. I'd like you to meet a colleague of mine shortly. His name is Ian Hutchison." Jane, my wife, got a phone call later that day from Ian, and it was agreed we'd meet up a few days later. I remember it well. Just like the day of my bike crash, the sun was shining broad. It was a beautiful day. It was the day of the royal wedding of William and Kate. And Ian decided that, having said we'd meet up in Bart Square, that his first consultation would in fact take place in the sunshine, with a coffee for the adults and a nasal feed for me on the outside terrace of Carluccio's in St. Bart's Square. Unusual, but everything about Professor Hutchison, and indeed about maxillofacial stuff, is unusual. I got to find out. Ian told me in short order that indeed the repatriated bone and skin hadn't taken. It was dead, and in truth, if I was honest, I knew, because I could smell it. He poked his nose inside my plaster of Paris casing, would you believe, and took a sniff. It was dead. He then said, "We'll fix you. You'll need to undergo tests, x-ray scans, but we'll do almost certainly a transplant from your shoulder of bone and skin and form a new jaw and lower face. A couple of months later, we'll do a thing called a carapandage flap operation to give you a mouth surround so you can eat properly." And as part of that operation, he said he'd introduce me to a brilliant implant dentist, who I think you'll be hearing about today, Andrew Darwood, who put some teeth in my head. And after that, there'd be just a few operations to widen my mouth. Couldn't be simpler. He said the most difficult stuff would be done within 6 months, and the rest would take a further 9 to 12. Now, I don't often talk in public about my sexual orientation, but I can reveal that I'm not greatly into kissing strangers, and especially strangers of the same gender. And in any case, my nasal feeding kit would have got in the way. But I could have kissed Ian Hutchison that day. He gave me such a strong message of hope, which leads me to the first of my 3 messages today. You brilliant people, give your patients solutions, you give them options, you deal with uncertainties. But another thing you give us, your patients, your human beings, is to give us hope amongst all those uncertainties. How you communicate the lack of certainty about the type of treatment which works best is very important. And clearly, you have to make judgments about your patient's ability to cope. But in all of this, if you can thread your message through with hope, you administer a shot, a very strong shot of energy source. I wanted hope, and I didn't give a damn about the uncertainties. The second thing I want to tell you today I learnt was that every patient needs to have a patient advocate, a close family member, in my case, my wife Jane, or a friend. My problem with every consultation was that during the whole process, I never had any doubt at all that I was going to be fixed up. After all, I believed I was lucky to be alive. A few inches north, I'd be blind or brain dead. A few inches south, I'd have been decapitated. So I just knew I'd be fixed up and there'd be no problems. On the other hand, my wife, my patient advocate, would listen carefully, and after the consultation, she'd put me straight. And she would say, your optimism may be getting in the way here, George. She would remind me that whatever Ian or Simon or Andrew Darwood said was this and that and the other. These are the options, these are the risks, these are the uncertainties. All of it has sailed over my head. My guess is the majority of patients are so absolutely bamboozled by the process, they either are incapable of listening or don't listen. That certainly is my case. Which leads me to my 3rd point today. You'll be glad to know I'm coming to an end fairly soon. We learned there was a huge amount of variability between the different solutions proposed by different surgeons to manage my injuries. Even through my fog of optimism, or whether it is maybe the fog of 10 lots of general anaesthetic, I listened to a great deal of concerned debate about what is the right way of doing things between different surgeons. I even witnessed debate as to which treatment was best with only one surgeon present. Surprisingly, maybe, we found all of that very helpful. It mightn't work for everyone, but it did for us, especially as I had a great patient advocate who could see her way through these things. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, stating as John Cleese would say, the bleeding obvious, I'm absolutely delighted, A, to be here, and B, to say that I've had terrific treatment over the past 3 years. Remember, it was going to be 18 months. In fact, it was 3 years. I once asked Ian, he told me 18 months here. He said, yeah, I'll tell all the girls that, don't worry. I've had 10 hospital procedures, 4 dental procedures, and numerous consultations. What's been achieved isn't much short of a miracle. I guess a miracle would be the George Clooney look I asked for at the start, complete with hair. But there was never any chance. But I'm realistic. My former appearance is just a memory. But even more importantly, though, eating, talking, smiling are all activities which I used to take for granted, but I now have to work at very hard indeed. Today, you'll notice my speech has no B's in it, because B's are a bugger to say. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled that for the first time the UK has a national centre that will lead the world in doing research to explore the treatment of facial problems. On behalf of all your patients, or should I say human beings, I wish it every success. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
So I'm the dumb trauma jock at Whitechapel, and you'll be pleased to know that there's not an awful lot of gore in this show, unlike my medical ones when there usually is. The first slide really is of 3 massive people in my life. The top left is Harold Gillies, who invented facial plastic surgery in World War I trauma patients. Very, very seminal to discuss this time of an anniversary. The chap on the right is Cairns, who's a neurosurgeon. Both were from the Royal London and Barts, and Cairns was famous for looking after Lawrence of Arabia, and from that invented the crash helmet, so it's probably been one of the few neurosurgeons that's actually saved lots of lives. Ba-boom. The person on the bottom needs no introduction, and I certainly have kept Steve Jobs in his life. I certainly paid a lot of money to him and his beloved company. But what they have all in common is that they just did the hell what they liked. Okay, so Gillies decided to go to the trenches and take some tickets with him, which said, deliver to Harold Gillies, and poor patients merged back from the Western Front, having been shot in the face by a German sniper usually, and brought to him at Sidcup. And he just invented stuff. Okay, now we can't do that now, or so you think. I'll just introduce you to a few of my friends, and with friends like these, who's these enemies, you know, I mean, I have to say. And a lot of literature that you see in the scientific literature populated by maxillofacial surgeons is largely centered on how good you are as an individual or how busy your unit is. And I think what NFORC can do is get rid of this tribalism as best we can. I like this one. This is culled from the internet this morning. Ed Miliband will target tobacco firms, tax dodgers, and London's wealthy homeowners, the real scum of our society. And it could have been any of them. It's not. I pick on poor Ed, but it could have been any of them. But you know, there's a real thing about value for money now, and I think as all of us in this room at some stage will pay taxes, and actually it's really important that we deliver the right care. And the right care really is every patient, every time, in a timely manner, but also remembering that you've got to teach your registrars and make them happy, and also have a happy patient. If all of those things are there, you have a happy surgeon, which is why people like Ian and I get up in the morning to go to work. So I'm going to just illustrate this by a particular example. Does everyone recognise this picture? It probably is familiar to me. This is the first girl I fell in love with, and I think I still am. It's Steve McCurry's famous Afghan girl picture. I think an absolutely beautiful picture. And I'm going to talk about injuries of this area. Now, all those of you who are non-surgeons or not involved in healthcare, I just want, for 1 second, I want you to close one eye and hold your finger out and try and get your other finger to meet. Okay. When you've done that, let's put it apart again. Now open both eyes. Okay, and do the same. And you'll see that it's much easier with binocular vision. Okay, so going back to Ian's talk about function, okay, we need two eyes that basically form an image to give us depth perception. And the trauma around this area compromises that. Okay, so it has a functional problem. Plus the fact that if you want to look beautiful, and look at her, not me, you want to have a nice symmetrical face. So that's kind of what this is all about. Why is it important? Okay, so this is my demographic of what Chris Bridle, my colleague, and I do every year. And people say trauma is random, but if you look at the graphs, they're very similar. And we're talking about this column here. So every year, Chris and I do between us about 240, 250 cheekbone fractures with eye socket repair, and some of the other ones, the middle third and craniofacial, also have orbits. So we have to know quite a lot about this area. And I can tell you my operation time is 45 minutes, roughly, for an orbit. And I can tell you that most of my patients go home the same day. So it keeps my managers very happy, because I save the trust about 600k a year on one diagnosis. But another study tells me that what keeps my patient in is, in fact, what time of day they had the operation, not what I did to them. And I think that's pretty a mind-blowing thought. So if you look at the literature, and just to orientate you, this is somebody who's had a razor blade cut from ear to ear. So you have right eye and left eye socket. And you'll notice that there's a hole here. Now, it's a big hole, okay, and it's difficult to fix. It's behind this region here, which is quite difficult to get at, okay, and really something which I am very interested in. And we can mirror the normal side to the abnormal side, and then we can navigate using an expensive satellite navigator equipment that I won a charity with for, and navigate the reconstruction. So you mirror one side to the other. Now that's the kind of thing that gets into a paper. And everyone thinks, God, Holmes is a lucky sod. He's got all these new toys to play with. Right, little do they know how hard I had to do to get it. But if you take the smallest fracture I could find in my library yesterday, this is from the side, and you can see the fracture here. And this is from the front, which apes the image you've just seen. And there is no core agreement on what size of defect and what size of position of defect on A, what material you use, we're getting better at it, and B, whether you treat it or not. Now, with Dr. Buick sitting in the front row, who's one of the guardians of the public purse, that's important, because is Holmes doing 200 orbits a year who should be doing 20? And the answer probably is not, I hope. For me. Or is he giving value for money? And we need to know that, and that's what NFORC is about. I'm going to bring Ian up to the present day, and my heart goes out to Phil Hughes and his family for a terrible injury, all those who saw the news yesterday. And the truth about it is, Ian is right, there is an airbag effect. But we studied this, and we've studied people who've been hit from the front with base of skull fractures, and people who've been hit from the side. And if you look at the side view, this is Johnny Stevens and Barry Evans co-research with me. This is the front impact, and this is the side impact. And when the poor cricketer turned his head, he got hit from the side. And you'll see the fracture propagation is much more around the bits of brain that really matter. If you smash this part of your brain up, you simply behave a bit odd. If you fracture this part of the brain, you don't do very well. And we know that patients who have that lateral vector do have a higher instance of needing neurosurgical intervention, have a higher instance of bad outcome. And that explains why this chap that you see a before and after, so the rotating skull, hopefully, is the before. And he was so badly smashed up that his top teeth didn't meet and the fracture went from here to here. This explains why this gentleman had a cup of coffee in recovery half hour after the surgery, and why we never got to this patient who was hit from the side. Okay, equivalent forces, different vectors, research, outcome. But what we don't know, we do know that 35% of my patients are depressed after meeting me. I hope it's the trauma, not the actual treatment I give them. But we don't know how the anterior skull base people behave. We don't know, and we also want to be able to target people so we can get the patients day one, the waiting list for rehabilitation at Roehampton or wherever you want to send them, Putney or wherever you want to send them, and get a much more efficient targeted healthcare. So trauma research, I think we know what to do most of the time. We need to refine what we're doing, and you can't do that in a test tube bottle. You have to do it with the patient population. And what ultimately matters is happy patients, right treatment, right time, every time. I like the last phone. You'll appreciate that's an Android phone rather than an iPhone.
So hi there, my name is Tom, and about 15 years ago I was in really what was at the time a dream job for me. I work and did work in an industry which is probably one of the industries out there which is most focused on people and image. It's not the music industry, it's not modelling, and no, I'm not a banker. But it is an industry where people are bought into very heavily. And about 6 weeks into this job that I got, it was with the company that everybody wanted to work for. It was working on an account which everybody wanted to work for or work on. I went out to an event which had been put on by one of our major suppliers. And on the way back from that event, I was with some of my colleagues, and we stopped at a local petrol station that was about the only place open at that time for two reasons. One was as a point of reference so that we could call some taxis and get ourselves home. And the other was just to sort of stock up on supplies that people were after. Outside that petrol station, there was a dog that was tied up. And we all went into the petrol station, and I went about stroking this dog. The dog jumped, as I moved away from the dog jumped up and hit me. My first reaction was this dog has hit me really quite hard in the face. I then took away my hand to see a jet of blood hit the floor about 4 feet away from me, and I thought, oh no, he's bitten me. A lot of commotion, went to hospital in an ambulance, arrived at A&E, and when I was told that the reason I hadn't been seen for some time was because the plastic surgeon was making his way over from his bed, I got a bit confused as to why I needed a plastic surgeon for essentially a couple of stitches. At which point my friend said to me, Tom, do you really know what's happened to you? And I said, well, I've just got a bit of a bad nosebleed. And one of the chaps said, what do you think's in this bag, Tom? And in the bag was 2 bags of frozen peas, and in between those frozen peas was the end of my nose. At which point the panic set in slightly. I I've always been a bit accident prone, to the point where I had so many admissions to A&E as a child with head injuries that we had a knock on the door from social services. But with all those injuries that I've had along the way, I have to say that this is the one which really was sort of beyond comprehension. So in A&E, the end of the nose was taken from the 2 bags of bird's eye peas, placed back on my nose and reattached. Unfortunately, this didn't take. It went black. It got a bit smelly, what then happened was a whole series of appointments to the clinic. I think really the sort of worst of those was when, for the first time, the sort of bandages were taken off, and I saw the full extent of the injury that I'd had, because up until then it had, I hadn't actually physically seen it. And I have to say that Pat, who I think is here, was a fantastic nurse that day and every day when I visited the clinic. Family and friends were incredibly supportive through the experience. The whole sort of process actually enabled me to rekindle the relationship I had with my father, who stepped in and offered me a place to stay when I was recouping and off work. But I think everyone was really quite worried as to what the outcome of the repair work was going to be. And that repair work really was a long process of a number of operations. The first of which was attaching a flap of skin from my forehead, which was brought down over my nose to replace the piece that had been bitten off. There was also cartilage taken from my ear to help the structure of the nose look a little bit more normal. And then there were multiple procedures after that where the tip of the nose was sculpted and made to look more like a nose rather than a piece of forehead stuck on the end of a nose. And this went on for a number of years. I think probably the most frightening part of it was after one of the sculpting processes or procedures, there was a little bit at the end of my nose which started to go black. It basically had died a little bit, and this was absolutely terrifying, because it was at this point where I thought, I'm back to square one. They're going to have to take another flap from my chin. My face is going to look more like Spaghetti Junction than a face. However, the way in which I kind of dealt with the situation myself was more to refuse to get too hung up on what I looked like when there was still more work to be done. And one of the things that really helped in that process as well was meeting other patients who had had traumas or disfigurements of their own. And this was really helped by the art project, and you can see a lot of the art which is around today, which Ian facilitated. And that was a really cathartic process for me, to actually meet with other people and see the artwork and see behind the traumas that people had. And it helped me feel that perhaps other people would look at me in that same way, not just see the scars, but see beyond that. I mentioned earlier that I work in an industry which is, very, dare I say, hung up on appearance and image. I had 2 particular things that I was anxious about when thinking about what my face would look like and what effect it might have on my everyday life. One of them was actually about going out to bars and nightclubs, something I did quite a lot. I had this innate fear of getting to the door somewhere and the doorman taking one look at me and thinking, here's a guy that gets in too many fights, you're not coming in. That actually never, ever happened. The other thing I was anxious about was job interviews. That all-important first impression. I interview people quite a lot in what I do. I have to be honest, not just on their facial appearance, of course, but I generally make up my mind as to whether I think someone's right for the job in the first few minutes of an interview. And I was very, very conscious of that. On both of those fronts, I do still get into nightclubs. Yes, I still do go to nightclubs, and I've still got it, I promise you. And I've had a number of jobs since the incident happened. And jobs which have not enabled me, but have meant that I have had to have a lot of client face-to-face meetings, presentations, being on conference stages in England and across Europe and even in the US as well. So it's not actually hindered me. So both of those fears that I had proved to be unfounded. Since the injuries happened, I also met my wife. She has only ever known me with a funny face. Not to say that it wasn't funny to begin with. We've also had 2 wonderful children, and they know me as who I am. They don't question my nose or my face any more than they question my taste in music or the way in which I dance around the kitchen. All in all, I'd say that the work that Ian and his team have done has been a success. Yes, I would prefer it if my face didn't looked like it did before I was bitten by a rather hungry dog, but I know that it's not going to happen. But I am pleased with the outcome. I do lead a normal life. It hasn't held me back in any way. And with regards to, to the work that NFORC are doing, I think, if surgeons can better share knowledge, insight and data to help people get the sorts of results that I've had, then I'm certainly supportive of that. Thank you.